Hi, third graders. So today we are going to quickly go through chapter 17, and it might seem kind of silly, but we're going to do that by just going through the chapter wrap up. So normally we would never do this, but we really need to get to chapter 19, which is all about area and perimeter. So we're just going to quickly go through this chapter wrap up for chapter 17. It's all about angles and lines. And there's also a really fun Go Noodle song. If you guys have access to Go Noodle at home, just type in lines and angles. That's a really fun one. And then I have another YouTube video that I'm going to put up there on Google Classroom that has some fun lines and angles songs. And it's all about two-dimensional and three-dimensional shapes and that kind of thing. So let's get started. Okay, so basically a point is an exact location in space. So if we look right here, this little tiny dot, this is a point. And we could say this is point A. A line is a straight path that goes on without ends in both directions. So think about when we make our number lines, guys. Remember, we know that the numbers keep going in both directions forever. So that's the same thing with a line. And the way we know it's a line is if it has those little arrows on the ends, just like that. So this line, notice it has 2 points on it. So we could call this line line AB, or we could call it line BA. Okay, so that's a line. Now the next one is called a line segment. So the word segment just means a piece or part of something. So we can think of this as kind of like part of a line. It's called a line segment. And the reason we know that it's only part of a line and not the full line is because we don't see those arrows on the side. So we just have a point here, point A, and we have a point here, point B, and there is a line in between them. So that would just be a line segment. And since it's labeled with an A and a B, we could call it line segment AB, or we could call it line segment BA. So the most important thing to remember is if it has the arrows, it's a line. If it doesn't have arrows and it just has 2 points at the ends, it's called a line segment. Okay, moving on to angles. So hopefully we know that angles are formed when 2 line segments have the same end point. So that might sound a little confusing, but let's look at an example and you should see that it's not too complicated. If we look here, we can see a line segment that's going straight up and down. We call that vertical, remember guys? And then we have another line segment that is going sideways. So we know that's called horizontal. And we can see that they both have the same end point. So this line segment has this endpoint right here, and this one has this endpoint as well. So since they share an endpoint, they make what's called an angle. So it basically just means wherever 2 lines or line segments meet. And see this little, looks kind of like a box right here. So we use this to show that this is a right angle. So they meet at a point that's called 90 degrees. So you're going to get more into that kind of thing in 4th grade. But for right now, I just want you to look at this shape and see if you can think of some things in real life that might have right angles in them. So just think about that for a minute. What have you seen that is made up of right angles? So think of maybe some things in your house, maybe some things in our classroom. Okay, so hopefully you came up with some things that are made up of right angles. Some of the things that I'm thinking of are things that I see when I'm looking around the room that I'm sitting in right now. So the first thing I noticed was a piece of paper on the table in front of me. Now I can see that this piece of paper is made up of 4 right angles. So if we think about it, each side of the paper could be considered to be a line segment, right? Okay, so that piece of paper was the first thing that I thought of that has right angles in it. I'm also looking around and I notice the desk where I'm sitting is made up of 4 right angles as well. I'm also seeing my windows. My windows are made up of right angles as well. So all of the things that I'm seeing, I'm noticing they're all rectangles or they're squares. So we definitely know that rectangles and squares have right angles in them. And this also tells us a folded piece of paper can be used to check for right angles. So if you have a piece of paper, you could fold it in half and you could hold it up to a shape and see if the angle on the shape that you're looking at, if it lines up perfectly with that piece of paper, then you would know it's a right angle. So let's look back up here for a second. Notice the folded piece of paper here. When the corner of the paper is put right where those 2 line segments meet, right there at that angle, we can see that that piece of paper lines up perfectly. There's no paper on this side of the line segment, and there's no paper on this side of the line segment. So this is definitely a right angle. Now, if we look down here, and we put that piece of paper right here at where these 2 line segments meet at this angle that they're forming, we can see that this is much smaller, right, than a right angle. If it were a right angle, we wouldn't be able to see all of this paper right here. It would be lined up perfectly with the paper. So since we can see that this angle is definitely smaller than a right angle, this is what's called an acute angle. So I like to remember that by thinking, oh, it's so little and cute. So we know that an acute angle is less than or smaller than a right angle. It's acute angle. And then over here, we have 2 more line segments that are meeting at this point right here. So this is where the angle is forming. And when we put our piece of paper there, we can see that this line segment is way over here. So it's much bigger than a right angle. It is what's called an obtuse angle. So if you open your arms wide, you can make an obtuse angle. If you bring one arm around to the side, like the little alligator in our greater than and less than sign, then we can make our acute angle. Okay guys, so there are a couple more really important things from chapter 17 that we need to learn. The first one is called perpendicular lines. So that's a really long, big word, and all it means is 2 lines or line segments that meet at right angles. Since we just learned all about right angles, then we can easily see that there's a right angle right here, and there's a right angle here. If we were to hold up our piece of paper into this corner where the angle is formed, we would see that it would line up perfectly. It would also line up perfectly down here. So that's how we know they are right angles, and they're also called perpendicular lines because they are meeting at a right angle. And most of the shapes that we thought of earlier, such as a rectangle or square, those would also be made up of line segments, and they would be made up of line segments that meet at right angles, so they would be made up of perpendicular lines or line segments. So this is telling us that perpendicular line segments AB, that's this one right here, that's the segment AB, remember, because it's got a point here, point A, and a point here, point B, so we can call it line segment AB. So that line segment is perpendicular to line segment AD. And the reason those 2 line segments are perpendicular is because they meet right here at a right angle. So anytime two line segments or lines meet at a right angle, they are called perpendicular lines or line segments. Okay, so we can see that line segment AD is also perpendicular to line segment DC because these two line segments also meet right here and form a right angle. So these two line segments are also perpendicular. Okay guys, moving on to parallel lines and parallel line segments. I wish we were in the classroom right now because I have this super cute little poster that I made with two pencils, and I have the two pencils and they are laying next to each other sideways, and it says, "Parallel lines have so much in common, it's a shame they'll never meet." So it says parallel lines and line segments will not meet no matter how long you draw them. The distance between them is always the same. So if we look at this shape right here, we can see that line segment AB right here is parallel to line segment DC. So if we were to keep drawing this line segment forever in both directions, and we did the same thing with this one, they would never, ever, ever, ever meet because they will always be this exact same distance apart. So those are parallel lines. Okay guys, so I want you to think about those shapes that we were talking about earlier. So we decided that rectangles and squares definitely have some perpendicular lines, right? Because they have 4 right angles. When we look at a rectangle or square, we can see that they have 4 right angles, so that's perpendicular lines. Now, what about parallel lines? Do you think squares and rectangles have parallel lines as well? If you said yes, nice job. Okay guys, so I drew us a rectangle so we can take a look at it and we can see that the rectangle is made up of 4 right angles. So we have an angle here, we have a right angle here, we have a right angle here, and we have a right angle here. So that means that the line segments in a rectangle are perpendicular because they meet at right angles. Now looking at this rectangle, we can see that the opposite sides are also parallel. Now if we were to think about this top side, if we kept going in either direction forever, and this bottom one, if we did the same thing, they would still never, ever, ever, ever meet because they will be exactly the same distance apart the whole way. And the same thing for the sides of this rectangle. If we were to keep going and up and down forever and ever, or this one up and down forever and ever, these two line segments would never meet either. So they are what's called parallel. Okay guys, quick recap. This is a point. This is a line. It has the arrows. This is a line segment. It has stopping points. This is a right angle. This is an acute angle. This one is an obtuse angle. Perpendicular lines and line segments meet at right angles, and parallel lines will never meet as long as they go. They could keep going in either direction and they would never meet. Your homework, guys, is to start looking for these angles and lines in your house, or if you go outside, start looking and seeing if you can find anything that has either parallel lines, perpendicular lines, or if you see right angles. So your homework is to spot those things and to tell somebody. So you can either tell mom, dad, grandma, grandpa, your big brother, or little sister. Or you could even email me and tell me some of the things that you see in the world around you. All right, guys, that's it for chapter 17, and we're going to move right on to chapter 18 tomorrow. So don't forget to watch the YouTube videos, and I'll try to give you a link to the Go Noodle if I can find it. All right, guys, see you later.